Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Sugi,
Yes.
did you know that in 1830, to get food on the table, a French worker had to work for 15 hours?
Oh my God, seriously.
And in 1970, 140 years later, how long do you think it took? How much work do you think you had to do to get a burger in 1970?
I don't know, 6 hours,
An hour
7 hours?
and 10
Oh
minutes.
my God, that's a
Pretty
huge
good.
change. That's
Yeah.
well, that's encouraging. So why do you know this exactly?
I've been reading the history of capitalism. I've decided to, educate myself.
So the history of mankind.
Well, you know what? Actually, according to the book that I've been reading, it's not been going on forever. It's younger than that,
So how long is this history of capitalism?
about 1,000 years and 1,000 pages. So it's like a page per year. Like,
Oh my God. Okay. And
and it's just great. It's a fantastic total page turner of a book, And the author Sven Beckert is here to join us today. Sven Beckert is Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard. His research and teaching centers on the history of the United States in the 19th century, with a particular emphasis on the history of capitalism, including its economic, social, political, and global dimensions. He is the author of, among others, Empire of Cotton, A Global History, which won multiple awards and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Beckert's work has been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Humboldt Foundation, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, and the New York Public Library Center for Scholars, and Writers, among others. He has lectured all over the world and is joining us today to talk about his new book, Capitalism, A Global History, which was just on the New York Times Notable Books of the Year list. Sven, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
we really appreciate it. So we talk about capitalism all the time, including on this show, but
Um,
we take much trouble to define it so that we all share an understanding of what it is. And that's something that you address in your introduction, and you eventually define it as, and I'm quoting here, a global process in which economic life is fundamentally driven by the ceaseless accumulation of privately controlled capital, is structured by the state, and propels the ever expanding commodification of inputs and outputs, including labor, creating constantly shifting boundaries between its outside and inside. And you note that capitalism is undogmatic and a global process that has to be understood globally. And I wonder if you can tell our listeners a little bit more about arriving at this definition.
yes, so the book is first and foremost an effort to understand the history of capitalism and to tell the history of capitalism. And it starts out with the observation that we now live in a world which is deeply structured by that capitalism. The largest processes we inhabit, from global trade to the way we work, the way we consume, are structured by this capitalist revolution. And so are the most intimate, or some of the most intimate parts of our lives that are also structured by that capitalist revolution. So this is the starting point of the book. And in some ways, the book is an effort to understand how we got to this point. How did history evolve in the past 1,000 years to get us to this particular point? And so the book, first and foremost, is an effort to tell the history of capitalism as it actually unfolded. It's an effort to tell the history of capitalism, of what I call capitalism in action. And and what we see when we do that, we see that capitalism shifted drastically over time. It looked very different in the 1600s than it looks in the 21st century, and it also was very different in very many different parts of the world. But for us to be able to analyze that as one particular kind of economic logic that, despite its differences and variations, is related to one another, we have to kind of define of what makes this capitalism special, what defines that form of economic life and distinguishes it from other forms of economic life. And this is the definition that you just read. So the definition, I didn't come to that definition to answer your question directly. I didn't come to that definition through kind of an abstract consideration of the logic of capitalism, but I came to that out of the reading of the actual history of capitalism.
I also assume that there are other definitions of capitalism, like in the academy and among others. Though people argue about things just exactly like this, right? So it's controversial in itself within the academy to define something as well known as capitalism, I would assume. And that there's people who think your definition is wrong or your definition is contradicting someone else's definition. Am I wrong about that process of
No,
how
no,
academics work?
you're absolutely right. And of course, in academia, people, disagree about almost everything. And yes, there are people who think about it, think about what the core of capitalism is differently. There is a popular understanding about capitalism that it's defined by societies in which economic life is structured by wage labor. I disagree with that. And then there are definitions of capitalism that somehow link capitalism as such to modern industry as it emerged after the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. And I also disagree with that. But look, the book is definitely not a kind of debate with my colleagues about how best to define capitalism. And in some ways, I think that's also not the most interesting conversation to have about capitalism. But the book is really about telling the history of capitalism and trying to understand how we got to a point in which that particular kind of economic logic structures so much of our lives today. And to tell that history, to tell it from a global perspective, but often through local perspectives, through local lenses, through telling local stories, and thus to understand capitalism as it unfolded historically. And I think that way of looking at capitalism in the end is more productive than endless conversations about how exactly
Well,
should we
we
define.
definitely agree.
Okay, good.
I
I'm
do
happy
think
to
it's
hear
just
that.
interesting to think about, to know that that's all happening in the background of how
Yes.
you're
So
doing a
so I
book
think
like
the book,
this.
I think that a reader who would seek to trace the endless conversations on how best to define capitalism, they would not be well served by this book. The book is for readers who are, interested in understanding and learning about the history of capitalism during the past 1,000 years.
Well, let's go to that history. And you mentioned that some people think that capitalism started with industrial, but labor or industrial capitalism. But you talk about what's called war capitalism in the 1500s, which was a new idea to me. And maybe it's, maybe that's my fault. But I wonder if you could define that and then talk about, that transition from what you call war capitalism into industrial capitalism. And could industrial capitalism have happened without this prior form of capitalism?
Yes, this is a great question, and that is an important argument of the book, an important observation of the book. Basically, what I find by looking at 1,000 years of history, I find that capitalism shifted its shape quite drastically in those 1,000 years. And I actually start out with looking at a kind of archipelago of merchant communities all over the world in the first half of the second millennium, so in the years between 1000 and 1500, to see how this strange logic that we talked about earlier, how that logic emerged and how that logic was placed within larger societies. And we get to know about merchant communities in China, in India, in Africa, in the Arab world, in Europe, and elsewhere. And then we see, and this is kind of the second part of the book, we get to see how this logic that was for so long limited to just a few what I call islands of capital, just small communities of merchants in various parts of the world. We trace how this logic now spreads into other spheres of economic life. And it spreads first and foremost into agriculture, because this is what most humans did at this moment in time. And then to some degree, it also spreads into manufacturing. And when we look at the agricultural side of it, when we look at how the logic of capital, how merchants and merchant capital infuse the world's countryside, we see a very peculiar process happening. Namely, we see that a coalition between European merchants and European rulers pushed that logic into distant countrysides, such as on the west coast of Africa, on the Caribbean Isles, and then, of course, also into South and North America. So we see an important role of colonial expansion in this early history of capitalism. We see that also in the sphere of commercial expansion, the merchants who started to trade with India and China. We see also there this kind of colonial expansion of European capital and European states. So this is one of the crucial kind of characterizing features of this particular moment in the history of capitalism. And then we, of course, also see that this new form of production that now emerges in some parts of the world, for example, on the Caribbean island of Barbados, which I discuss in great detail, rests on two things. It rests on the dispossession of indigenous landowners, and it rests, of course, on the enslavement of Africans who come to labor on these sugar plantations and later also tobacco plantations, cotton plantations, coffee plantations, and others. So slavery and enslavement becomes another important factor of this early moment in the history of capitalism. And then third, or fourth already, fourth is that in this moment of the history of capitalism, merchants are often quite distant from the state, and they come to rule political territories in distant parts of the world. Again, like the East India Company, the English East India Company, that comes to rule parts of Bengal, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, that comes to rule parts of what is now Indonesia. So these four factors: the colonial expansion, the dispossession of indigenous lands, the enslavement of workers, and kind of state distant capital owners who come to enjoy political power. These become important to this particular moment in the history of capitalism. Now, your question was, how does that feed into kind of industrial capitalism?
Well, we're going to give you. Well, you know what? That. I think that question was too broad, and Suki has actually a question very specifically
Yeah.
about the period that you're talking about. So why don't we do that before we move into industrial capitalism?
Okay.
So, before I do that, I just want to point out for our listeners that, I mean, you can sort of hear in Sven's answers some of the ways that this book positions itself, right? Specifically, a reclamation of capitalism as a territory for a historian to explore. And it's also a book about people, which I think is one of the reasons it's actually so interesting to read. It's like very much what you phrase it as an actor-centric telling, but I mean, it's a book that has a lot of characters in it. And you're talking about like that first section you were talking about was what you framed as capitalists before capitalism, which was like a helpful kind of intro to the thousand years that you're talking about. And so then you're talking about right, this connection between capitalism and exploitation, specifically in this relationship to agriculture. You mentioned Barbados, continuous European colonial expansion. You mentioned sugar, and there's some others in here: wool, wheat, tea, grapes, talking about like 1750s. And then you also talk about what you call the great connecting of urban and rural life. This is also one of the most interesting things about the book to me. Like you mentioned specifically, right, the importance of the countryside and the way that we have continuously, like perhaps even almost unconsciously, framed capitalism as something that affects cities, that is centered in cities, that is influenced by cities, made by cities, and so therefore discussed in terms of cities. And one of the things that you frame so usefully and interestingly is this flow from urban to rural and back again, which I thought was so interesting. And then rural communities in this are usually at a disadvantage. But the great connecting of urban and rural life allow these investments of capitalism into agriculture, and this creates this permanent alteration and complication of trade relationships. So I'm curious if we could just talk a little bit about how, like, could capitalism have erupted as it did without these complicated modes of exploitation and the involvement of agriculture? If you could talk a little bit about what you call the great connecting and how it continues to shape capitalist structures today.
No, the short answer is no. Capitalists emerge in cities, as we discussed earlier, but capitalism, I'm arguing, emerged in the countryside. And it makes total sense because if you think about the world throughout most of human history, most people lived in the countryside and most people engaged in agriculture. And thus, the first kind of influx of the logic of capital that we discussed earlier into production, of course, happened in the countryside. And that is also kind of a way to think about capitalism differently from how we often think about capitalism, because often when we think about capitalism, we think about cities and we think about heavy industry. You know, we think about smokestacks, we think about Detroit and places like that. But one of the core arguments of the book is that we really need to focus much more on the countryside to understand capitalism. And as you say, I do so not so much through kind of abstract discussions of these processes, but I do so very much by focusing on particular places and even on particular people, on particular actors. And I tell this history from that perspective in order to illuminate how this global world of capitalism came into being.
Can you say a little bit about the Great Connecting and what that means?
So the Great Connecting is just a moment when the world becomes now much more interconnected. So this is the moment when a world economy emerges. The European merchants, the trade with Indian merchants, and they trade with merchants off the coast of West Africa. They trade with merchants on the coast of East Africa. Chinese merchants trade with Indian merchants. And of course, European merchants also trade then into the Americas, into the Caribbean, and into North and South America. So there is a kind of intensification of global trade that goes along with the intensification of this kind of agrarian production that we talked about earlier.
One of the examples of specific people that you talk about in the book is Toussaint Louverture in Santo Domingo and what would become Haiti. The famous revolutionary leader who led a successful slave rebellion, in essence. Identify his rebellion as a transformative moment in the history of global capitalism as well. And can you talk about how this, as you put it, quote, sowed the seeds for what eventually became new systems of labor? So we're talking, this is moving on. You say we established this sort of slavery labor system, and this begins to change around that time. Could you talk about his role in that?
Yes, so this is another important argument I'm making in the book, that not just, rich merchants or powerful bureaucrats structure capitalism, but often people with very little power, with very few resources, have made a huge difference in structuring capitalism. And as we discussed earlier, at a particular moment in the history of capitalism, slavery was quite important in the production of things that were traded and consumed, and made many merchants rich. This system of slave-based plantation agriculture was, it persisted for a long time. It emerged in the 1400s off the coast of Africa. It moved to the Caribbean and then to Brazil and also later into North America. And it persisted for several hundred years, and it tended to it also expanded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this was kind of a powerful part of global capitalism. And as we know, by the end of the 19th century, plantation slavery is absent in global capitalism. So we move into a totally different world of capitalism. And one of the core reasons for that is that the enslaved themselves rebelled in many parts of the Americas, and in a persistent way. And of course, one of the most important rebellions of the enslaved people was the one that you mentioned, namely the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, in which Toussaint Louverture played an important role. But we can also list, for example, the American Civil War, which has been called by W.E.B. Du Bois as a kind of general strike of the enslaved. We can also consider this to be part of this rebellion against enslavement. And this rebellion is very effective, and it creates, its effect take a long time to work themselves out, but eventually they do succeed in doing away with plantation slavery. And as a result, a totally different kind of capitalism emerges with very different kinds of forms of labor mobilization. As we know, wage labor becomes quite crucial to that capitalism, but in the countryside also sharecropping, tenant farming, and other such labor regimes become very important in the world's countryside, including in the United States South.
Around this same time, in the mid 1800s, You also talk about a number of labor rebellions that are these are not slave rebellions, but they're laborers who are rebelling against their bosses in essence. One was this 1831 rebellion in Lyon, France, where I've spent a lot of time, and I actually did not know about this rebellion, so I was embarrassed about that. But where the silk workers took over the city, I'm very familiar with the silk working area of Lyon. It's really beautiful
Yeah.
part of the city, and then with all these traboules where they hid from the Nazis when the Nazis were occupying Lyon. And then in 1844 there was a Weavers' Rebellion in Silesia, where the weavers went and destroyed the looms, which they called bread theft machines. Interesting. I'm not going to try and say the actual local term. Could you talk about how this particular period fits into the arc of capitalism's history, and then read a section of the book that describes that?
Yeah, so that is a kind of amazing story, and that basically shows how radically departure the capitalist revolution really is. Once we hit the Industrial Revolution, workers in very much larger numbers now enter factory employment. But workers, people are often afraid to enter these factories. They don't want to work in a factory. They look at terror at factories. And it's for the first time in human history that large numbers of people engage in kind of coordinated industrial processes. And workers are generally mostly not organized, not like they would later be in trade unions, but workers engage in kind of spontaneous rebellions, and they hassle their employers. They stay away from work. They sing protest songs. So there is kind of this rebellious atmosphere in the world of wage labor as well that has a kind of very peculiar flavor to it in the mid 19th century. And let me just read a part of the book that that deals with this. Machines were a frequent target of workers' rebellions, often led by outworkers whose spinning wheels and handlooms were threatened by labor-saving contraptions. The quintessential story of machine breaking, which we encountered already, was that of the Luddites in northern England, handloom weavers who burned and smashed machinery during the 18 teens, only to be met by an 1812 law that made machine breaking a capital crime, resulting in executions and the forced exile of the rebels to various colonies. Similar movements characterized all areas of fledgling factory production. In the early 1840s, workers in Prague and Bohemia broke textile machinery that threatened their jobs. In the Ottoman Empire, machine breaking was an important way that workers made their voices heard, as in 1839, when women in Rumelia wrecked machinery. In 1851, women in a Samarkand textile factory attempted to destroy power looms, and in 1861, workers in Bursa set an entire factory ablaze. One of the most spectacular uprisings broke out in Lyon in 1831, when thousands of silk workers protesting their abysmal working and living conditions confronted wealthy silk merchants. Despite gunfire, the workers prevailed and secured power over the city until they were met with overwhelming military force that left hundreds dead, and left the bourgeois public shocked by the nature of the social tensions that the new capitalist civilization had wrought. The liberal Parisian Journal du Débat examined what it called secret of such sedition and found it rooted in a society that divided, quote, between the class that owns and the one who does not own. It was a frightening situation. The paper concluded as, quote, each manufacturer lives in his factory like the colonial planters in the middle of their slaves, one among 100, and the sedition of Lyon is a sort of Saint-Domingue insurrection, end quote. It is telling that in 1831, Saint-Domingue was still very much on the minds of French economic elites, confirming the importance of that revolution to the broader rebellions against old regime capitalism. Indeed, as the journal, like many others, saw, the emerging world of industry was one of nearly constant conflict, production disruptions, and outbursts of violence. Industry had irreversibly transformed the world, but it remained unclear if society could withstand the strain this had placed upon it. At mid-century, the balance of power remained decisively in favor of capital owners. Workers had to eat, And generally, to do so, they had to seek factory employment. Yet everywhere, workers battled their employers, and as they did so, they questioned the very legitimacy of the new capitalist civilization.
Thank you so much. Um, so I think reading this, I couldn't help but think of, we've done a number of episodes on artificial intelligence. That's been very much in the discourse lately. Artificial intelligence is in historical terms pretty young, but people are, of course, forecasting the job losses that will be caused by its popularization. So, what can past eras like the one you just read about tell us about what we might see in our society as AI kind of upends the balance between capital and labor?
That is a great question. And look, the book is not in the business of predicting the future, and I doubt that anybody can predict the future. But I think it does illuminate some patterns in the very long history of capitalism that are instructive to thinking about the present. And the most important one that I see here is that we see, by looking at 1,000 years of history, we see that capitalism shifted quite drastically over time. And we also see that capitalism is not the natural order of things, but it's a human-made order. It's a society that and a form of economic life that is created by a whole variety of people in all parts of the world. And yes, we have seen throughout the history of capitalism, we have seen amazing gains in productivity that were very much linked to the emergence of new kinds of technologies. We saw, the steam engine, we saw the automobile, and now we see the emergence of artificial intelligence. And these new technologies have, as I mentioned, have gone along with significant increases in human productivity. And maybe we should on the in some ways, that's a great thing, because we can produce much more, and we need to put much less labor into its production. The question is just, how do we distribute these productivity gains? Who gets to benefit from them? And if we look, for example, at the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, there were very, very significant productivity gains in these decades. And these productivity gains were pretty widely distributed within American society more broadly, including many workers benefited greatly from these gains in productivity. If we look at the computer revolution of the, let's say, 2000s, we see already that the productivity gains that came out of that were much less evenly distributed. They were captured much more by just a small part of American society. And now I think the question with artificial intelligence is not so much, is it a good thing or a bad thing? But the question is more, who gets to benefit from what might be, I mean, we are not certain about this, but what might be significant gains in productivity. In some ways, that could be a great opportunity for American society. It could make us either work fewer hours because we don't have to do some of the work we had to do previously, but it also might make us, materially better off because we are now much more productive. But this, in the end, is a kind of political decision. But the book, I think, should encourage us to think about these various possibilities, these various trajectories. The future is not set in stone. I mean, if one thing is that if the book shows one thing, is that the future is kind of open and that there are various futures possible at any given moment.
I do really like that point. I mean, that's what I got out of the book was looking at, oh, well, periods of concentration of wealth, which we're experiencing now, have happened before, and then there have been changes, and that has not, like I noted a line. This is from like in the middle of the book. You have a line where it says between 1880 and 1914, the top decile of French, British, and Swedish citizens controlled like 80 to 90% of all the prosperity of their nation. So that was another period of really high wealth concentration that changed later.
Yes,
And
I
so
mean,
it's
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, inequality is not an invention of capitalism. Obviously, inequality has persisted before capitalism, but within capitalism, the forms that inequality has taken have shifted drastically over time. And inequality has sharpened at certain moments in time, as you mentioned, and has also diminished at other moments in time. So in some ways, the inequality regime, the forms of inequality that we live in, are not, they are not a fact of nature. Yeah, like capitalism more broadly, it is not a fact of nature, but it's a human created order that we can also change. And as you say, we live in a world of almost absurd degrees of social inequality. I mean, it sometimes seems now when we look at the word and think about the impact of artificial intelligence, it sometimes seems that literally just a few families are going to capture almost all of the gains that come out of this.
Yeah.
That is, of course, this is kind of a radical form of inequality. And I think we also see, if we look around the world today and the politics of the world today, that in the end, politically, that kind of inequality is unsustainable within a democratic liberal society.
I think this is, I mean, it's interesting because I'm realizing sort of as you're talking that, right, we're sort of, if we are doomsayers about AI, and I frankly have been a doomsayer about AI, that one of the things we're subtly signing on for is like a certain form of capitalism,
Yeah.
whereas theoretically it could be something that reshapes capitalism such that like sort of extractive labor and sort of the assumption that we're all going to work ourselves to the bone could actually in a really widespread manner, it could theoretically vanish and we could become a society that's much more invested in art and culture. And I love this vision of the world. That's actually really great. And even though I have to balance that out with my sort of anger at the way that AI has been developed off of like stolen data, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm sort of assuming that one vision of an AI driven society is like a given, whereas it's actually not.
Yeah, no, again, I think the history of capitalism is very instructive. Stolen data is, something that is, the kind of dispossession is a kind of constant in the history of capitalism. We discussed that already when we looked at Barbados. Um, and yes, look, the book, in some ways ends on a somewhat optimistic note because I think sometimes we need to pause in all that talk about how dire things seem and how deeply many Americans feel economic pain. We should sometimes pause and remind ourselves we live in what is probably the richest society in the history of humanity. And that is certainly also a direct outcome of the capitalist revolution. We live in that society, and we can address most of the material problems that we face in society. We can feed everybody. We can provide everybody with an excellent education. We could provide everybody with access to excellent healthcare. This is all within our powers. This sets us apart from other societies, and this also sets us apart from other moments in human history. And that is a great thing. But of course, in a world in which a teeny minority of Americans capture almost all of the proceeds of these gains, we live in a society that becomes ever more unequal, and we are actually not addressing these problems. And sometimes, there is a sense that we cannot address these problems, but we can. Materially we can. I mean, maybe not politically, but materially we certainly can.
Well, I think I've discovered from reading your book what the problem is.
Yeah,
And I
what
think it
is
is
it?
the capitalists who are greedy, the guys at the top. They're the ones who it seems to be like I mean, labor is always having to fight with them. But like, what was remarkable to me, a particular line that I felt like summarized sort of like the capitalist, meaning not just capitalism as a system, but capitalism as a person who owns capital,
Yeah.
wants to exploit labor, wants money. In your chapter on reconstructing labor, this is like 1870 to 1920, you talked about how, okay, now slavery was done and landowners were like, what can we find that is just like slavery? Because we really like slavery. We don't want to be like pay more. We want to just find a way to reconstitute slavery. Could like, I mean, that keeps happening over and over again too, right? An exploitative system is defeated and then Cap's like, but I have a new idea, you know?
No. I mean, that is certainly historically true, but it's just as true that there have been moments in the history of capitalism that have resulted in a kind of different inequality regime in which there was a broader distribution of the wealth of American society or also other societies. So it doesn't
So
seem
who
to
would
be.
you point to as more successful or more thoughtful capitalist owners? Would it be someone like Henry Ford? I mean, who would you cite in this book as capitalists who did a better job of thinking about how to make the system more equitable?
I mean, there are certainly entrepreneurs who have different opinions on these matters, who are also very critical of the degree of social inequality that we see in American society today. And there are entrepreneurs. I mean, just think about Patagonia, the company that are, very much invested in environmental protection and protecting their workers. So there is a kind of diversity of, there is a diversity of approaches, but of course, I think the problem goes much deeper than the individual preferences of individual entrepreneurs. I mean, of course, people can do a lot of good in the world with their money, but the problem goes much deeper, and that is, uh, how do we across society distribute the wealth that we are collectively producing? And I think in the end, for that kind of being a good entrepreneur is a good thing, but it's not enough because there are other tools. I mean, what were the tools, during the 1950s and 1960s in which inequality was diminished? I think there are two most important tools. One was that industrial workers were by and large represented by trade unions in the United States, and these trade unions were collectively quite powerful, and they managed to gain significant increases in wages and significant increases in benefits. So this is clearly important to a kind of redistribution of wealth. And then there was also much higher taxation. I mean, the marginal tax rate was at 93% in the United States for very high income earners. That is a far cry from where we are right now. But there are all kinds of tax regimes possible, and there is nothing that keeps us from, seeking a kind of different inequality regimes through different forms of taxation and different taxation regimes in the United States today. That's of course a political problem. Then this is, but I don't think this is kind of as such definitely defined by capitalism as such.
So you're talking here, of course, about also the relationship of the state
Yeah,
to capitalism, which is part of the definition that I read back at the
yeah,
beginning of this
yeah,
conversation. So I want to bring this conversation to a close by asking you one last question about capitalism's relationship to government. So you have this chapter called A Time of Monsters,
yeah,
Industrial Capitalism, and this is 1918 to 1945, and it covers, of course, this period of extreme political upheaval and war, fascism's rise, the Soviet Union as an industrializing power, a global depression, which leads to the implementation of the New Deal. And so I think that most Americans think of capitalism as a unique product of so-called liberal democracies. And you kind of take pains to state upfront that this is, in your opinion, not the case. And you write, what we can see when we look at the global 1930s, however, is something different, namely that capitalism can flourish within a wide range of forms of political rule. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that. Are you arguing that capitalism is a force that supersedes and shapes all forms of government?
No, I don't think it's I mean, it has something to do with forms of government, yes, but I don't think it's kind of. This is exactly what I'm arguing against. I don't think you can, conclude that because we have a capitalist economy, we are going to live within particular political, particular forms of rule. Um, there has been for a long time, and it was very popular in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, there has been this idea that the expansion of capitalism brings automatically a kind of organization of political life along democratic, liberal rules. And broadly speaking, there is some truth to that because, of course, we see with the expansion of capitalism over the past 300 years, let's say, we see also an expansion of liberal democratic rule in many parts of the world. But the belief that there's a kind of necessary relationship from between the one and the other. I think that has been that can be questioned if we look at the world today, but also when we look at history, we see that the capitalist revolution has unfolded under a whole variety of political regimes. It has unfolded under monarchical rule, in the 18th century and before. It has unfolded under democratic liberal rule, such as in the United States. It has unfolded under authoritarian rule, such as in parts of Latin America or in many parts of the world today. And it has unfolded also under fascism, such as in Germany and Italy. So I think these kind of order confidence that we just the world becomes more capitalist and eventually the world is all going to become democratic and liberal liberal in the European sense, not in the American sense. That I think has been shown to be not true. Not that long ago, people believed, as China becomes more capitalist, its form of politics would also become more like our form of politics. But if you look at the world today, maybe we can see that instead of China becoming more like us, we are becoming more like China. So it is. Again, it's a complicated relationship, and that speaks to this larger point of the book that we have now indirectly approached a couple of times. Namely, capitalism is incredibly undogmatic, unlike most people who write about it. And this undogmatic nature of capitalism, I think, explains also why it is so incredibly dynamic.
Yeah, it's like I think that Americans think like they look at Russia right now, and they I like it, at least maybe right Americans on the left would say, well, they're doing capitalism, but it's the wrong way. And you're
Yeah.
saying like, no, 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 capital doesn't care. Like it'll do it. You want to do it that way, that's fine. And that sort of to me that made me and I wanted to mention a book that you were that I thought of when I was reading this is a uh, Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, where he argues that really the Second World War was just a capitalist sort of enterprise. The capitalism was thread through the war. It wasn't really about ideology. Anyway, complicated. We're a literature podcast, so if you're not familiar with that book, that's fine. I'll drop that one in there for my listeners. But this idea that capitalism to me, it felt like it is like so ingrained in everything that we're doing that almost governments don't matter that much. That it is actually more pervasive around the world. And now you
Okay,
can disagree with me to that, but that's what I got
I,
out of
I
it.
yeah, I disagree because yes, capitalism is pervasive, and the book traces how it became pervasive, and it took many hundreds of years to become so pervasive. But in every moment of its history, it's co-constituted by the state. So we cannot think of capitalism separate from the state. We cannot think about capitalism separate from politics. The one constitute the other, and I think therefore, I think capitalism is actually an unusually statist kind of economic order, which probably will surprise many of your listeners as well. But I think the book does kind of show that this is the case.
Sven, thanks so much for joining us. And listeners will encourage you to go check out his book, Capitalism, A Global History, which is fantastic, at a local independent bookstore near you.
Thank you so much. It was great being with you.